Eleanor Whitmore was 72 years old when her own son left her to die on the side of Briarwood Mountain Road in the worst blizzard Montana had seen in 40 years. She watched the taillights of his silver SUV disappear into the white chaos of the storm, and she understood with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins that Richard was not coming back. Not in 10 minutes, not in an hour, not ever. She expected panic. She expected her body to collapse under the weight of betrayal so total it defied language. What she didn't expect was the memory that surfaced in that frozen darkness, a memory of her late husband Thomas, dead now for 3 years, standing at the kitchen window of their farmhouse and pointing toward the mountain with a strange expression on his weathered face. "There's something up there, Ellie," he had said. "A something I built for you. Something for when everything else fails." She had dismissed it as the ramblings of a man whose mind was beginning to wander in his final months. But now, with the snow driving sideways and the cold already seeping through her thin coat, the coat Richard had told her would be warm enough for a quick drive to town, the coat that was not warm enough, that was never meant to be warm enough, Eleanor remembered, and she began to crawl. The road had been cleared just once that week, and the snowbanks on either side rose nearly to Eleanor's shoulders when she tried to stand. The wind knocked her down twice before she stopped trying to walk. Her knees hit the frozen ground, and she felt the impact travel up through her hip bones, through the spine that had carried her through 72 winters. Through the shoulders that had held grandchildren who no longer called, through the hands that had signed over power of attorney to her son 14 months ago because he had told her it was the right thing to do, because he had told her he loved her, because she had believed him. The snow soaked through her wool slacks in less than 3 minutes, and the cold that followed was not the cold of discomfort, but the cold of death, patient, thorough, and utterly without malice. Eleanor had nursed enough patients in her 38 years at Briarwood General Hospital to know what hypothermia looked like from the inside. First, the shivering, then the confusion, then a warmth that felt like mercy, but was actually the body surrendering. She was already shivering so hard, her teeth cracked against each other with every breath. She figured she had maybe 30 minutes before the confusion set in, maybe 45 before the false warmth, maybe an hour before she became another body the spring thaw would reveal, curled beside the road like a discarded thing, which was exactly what Richard and Patricia had decided she was. She crawled anyway, not toward the road. The road led back to the farmhouse that was no longer hers, back to the son who had watched her shiver in the passenger seat and said nothing, back to the daughter-in-law who had stopped pretending to smile 6 months ago. Eleanor crawled toward the mountain, toward the trees, toward something she couldn't see and wasn't sure existed, guided by nothing more than the ghost of her husband's voice and the stubborn fury that had kept her alive through every disappointment of her long life. Whilst the snow was knee-deep between the road and the tree line, and each inch forward cost her strength she couldn't afford to spend. Her gloves, thin leather driving gloves, another thing Richard had assured her would be sufficient, were soaked through within minutes, and her fingers began to lose sensation in a way that felt permanent. She kept moving. The pines rose around her like sentries, their branches heavy with snow, and the wind that had been screaming across the open road dropped to something almost bearable in their shelter. Eleanor's hip screamed where she had fallen against the car door when Richard shoved her out. Her wrists ached from the awkward angles of crawling. Her chest burned with each breath of air so cold it felt like swallowing glass. But she was moving, she was alive, and somewhere ahead of her, through the curtain of white that swallowed everything more than 10 feet away, she could almost see the shape of something that did not belong in this wilderness. Something with corners, something with walls, something that might have been built by the hands of a man who had loved her for 47 years. Eleanor had met Thomas Whitmore in the spring of 1975 when she was 24 years old and working the overnight shift in the emergency room of a hospital that no longer exists. He came in at 3:17 in the morning with a gash across his palm that ran from the base of his thumb to the heel of his hand. A woodworking accident, he explained, looking more embarrassed than pained, the result of a chisel that slipped when he was carving a bird for his mother's birthday. Eleanor had cleaned the wound and stitched it closed with 14 careful sutures, while Thomas watched her face with an expression she didn't understand until years later. He asked her to dinner before the anesthetic wore off. She said no. He asked again when he came back to have the stitches removed. She said no. He asked a third time when she ran into him at the grocery store 3 weeks later, and this time something in the steadiness of his gaze made her say yes. They were married 7 months after that first dinner, 47 years, 3 children, a farmhouse on 40 acres of land that Thomas's grandfather had cleared by hand in 1902. A life that had felt solid and permanent and real, right up until the moment it wasn't. Right up until the moment Eleanor found herself crawling through snow toward a cabin she wasn't sure existed, abandoned by the son she had nursed through scarlet fever when he was 4 years old. The cabin appeared through the storm like something from a fever dream, a dark shape against the white chaos, low and solid, and impossibly present in a place where nothing should have been. Eleanor stopped crawling when she saw it, partly because her arms had stopped responding properly, and partly because she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. The structure was small, maybe 20 feet by 15 feet, built from logs that had weathered to the color of old pewter. The roof was steep enough to shed snow, and the windows were dark, but there was a chimney rising from the center, and the door, painted red she could see now, a red that had faded to the color of dried blood. The door was facing her like an invitation, or a promise. Eleanor thought of Thomas standing at the kitchen window. Something I built for you. Something for when everything else fails. She had dismissed those words. She had smiled and nodded and changed the subject, because Thomas had been saying strange things in those final months, things that didn't always connect to the conversation they were having, things that seemed to come from some private world of memory and worry that she couldn't access. But he had been a carpenter for 50 years. He had built their farmhouse with his own hands. He had built cribs for their children and rocking chairs for their neighbors and a pergola for the backyard that still stood after 30 winters. Was it possible that he had also built this? A cabin no one knew existed, a cabin on land that belonged to the family. Beat a cabin waiting in the darkness for the exact moment when his wife would need it most. The last 50 feet to the door nearly killed her. Eleanor's body had stopped cooperating in ways that frightened her. Her fingers wouldn't close properly, her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, and there was a warmth spreading through her chest that she recognized with clinical detachment as the first stage of her organs beginning to shut down. She reached the door and discovered that she couldn't stand to open it. She reached up from her knees, grasping the cold metal of the handle, and pulled. Nothing. The door was stuck, or locked, or frozen shut. She couldn't tell which, and it didn't matter because she was going to die here on this porch, 3 feet from shelter, and there was nothing she could do about it. She pulled again, and her arms trembled. The metal bit into her frozen palms. And then, with a sound like ice cracking, the door swung inward, and Eleanor fell across the threshold into darkness. The smell hit her first. Wood smoke and dust and something else. Something alive, something that made her freeze even as the relative warmth of the cabin began to seep into her bones. She wasn't alone. She knew it before her eyes adjusted to the darkness, before she saw the faint glow of embers in the wood stove across the room, before she heard the small, sharp intake of breath that came from somewhere to her left. Someone was in the cabin. Someone had been living here. Someone was watching her right now, and Eleanor, who had spent 38 years as a nurse and thought she had seen everything, felt a fear that went beyond the physical danger of her situation. When she had expected the cabin to be empty if it existed at all, she had expected dust and cobwebs and perhaps a few of Thomas's tools, left behind like artifacts from another life. She had not expected presence. She had not expected the sound of movement in the darkness, quick and light, like an animal deciding whether to flee or fight. She opened her mouth to speak and found that her voice had frozen along with everything else. No sound came out, just breath, ragged and visible in the dim light from the stove. And then a voice, young, female, sharp with terror, spoke from the darkness. "Don't move, I have a knife." Eleanor didn't move, partly because the command was delivered with genuine menace, and partly because her body had given up on movement anyway. She lay on her side, just inside the door, with the cold wind still reaching for her from outside, and she waited for her eyes to adjust. Slowly, shapes emerged from the darkness. A table, a chair, the black bulk of the wood stove with its faint ember glow. And near the far wall, pressed into the corner like something wounded, a figure that was smaller than Eleanor had expected. Not a threat. A child? No, A young woman, maybe 20 or 25, wrapped in a blanket that might have been one of Thomas's old quilts, holding something that glinted in the dim light. A knife. The young woman had told the truth about that, but her voice, when she spoke again, had lost some of its edge. She sounded scared. She sounded young. She sounded like someone who had been alone for a very long time. "Who are you? How did you find this place?" Eleanor tried to speak and managed only a croak, and her body had begun to shake again. Proper shivering, which meant she wasn't dying quite as fast as she had feared. She tried again. "I'm Eleanor. My husband. I think my husband built this cabin." The silence that followed was so complete that Eleanor could hear the snow hitting the single window, could hear the embers shifting in the stove, could hear her own heart beating in her ears with a rhythm that was slower than it should have been. Then the figure in the corner moved, set the knife down on a surface Eleanor couldn't see, crossed the room in quick steps that spoke of familiarity with the space, knelt beside Eleanor with a rustle of fabric and a warmth that felt like a miracle. The young woman's face came into focus, pale, thin, framed by dark hair that hadn't been washed recently, the eyes that held something Eleanor couldn't quite read. And then the young woman spoke again, and her voice was no longer sharp or scared, but something else entirely, something that sounded like recognition. "Thomas Whitmore? Your husband was Thomas Whitmore?" Eleanor nodded. The movement cost her more than it should have. "Yes. How could you possibly know that?" The young woman didn't answer. Instead, she moved with sudden efficiency, closing the cabin door against the storm, adding wood to the stove, returning with a blanket that she wrapped around Eleanor's shoulders with hands that were calloused but gentle. She disappeared again and came back with a tin cup of something warm. Broth, Eleanor realized when the first sip hit her cracked lips. Chicken broth with herbs she couldn't identify, yet warm enough to spread through her chest like hope. The young woman watched her drink with an expression that had shifted again, from fear to confusion to something that looked almost like wonder. And when Eleanor had emptied the cup and felt the first real warmth begin to return to her extremities, the young woman spoke again. "My name is Sarah. I've been living here for 3 years. Your husband, Thomas, he found me. He saved my life. He built this cabin for me when I had nowhere else to go. And he told me stories about you, Mrs. Whitmore. He told me everything. He told me that someday, if things went wrong, you might find your way here. He told me to be ready." Eleanor stared at the young woman, Sarah, and felt the world she thought she understood begin to crack and shift beneath her. Thomas had never mentioned a Sarah. Thomas had never mentioned a cabin in the mountains. Thomas had been her husband for 47 years, and she had thought she knew every corner of his life, every secret he carried, every dream he held close. But here was proof that she had been wrong. Here was a cabin that shouldn't exist, a woman who shouldn't be here, a story she had never been told. And as the warmth of the broth spread through her body and the feeling returned to her frozen fingers, Eleanor understood that whatever she had thought she was crawling toward when she left the road, shelter, survival, death, it was not this. It was not a mystery that rewrote everything she thought she knew about the man she had loved. The storm howled outside, shaking the walls of the cabin like something alive and angry. Bash and Sarah moved around the small space with the ease of long familiarity, stoking the fire, lighting an oil lamp that cast golden shadows across the walls, heating more broth on the wood stove. Eleanor sat in a chair that she recognized, with a jolt of grief so sharp it took her breath away, as one of Thomas's creations. The armrests bore the same carved pattern, intertwining vines that decorated the headboard of their marriage bed. The seat had been worn smooth by years of use. Thomas had built this chair. Thomas had placed it here. Thomas had imagined her sitting in it, wrapped in quilts he had made, while a stranger heated broth on a stove he had installed. The impossibility of it pressed against Eleanor's chest, and she found she couldn't speak, couldn't form the questions that swirled through her mind like the snow outside. "Who are you? How did you know my husband? What is this place? What is happening?" The questions dissolved before they reached her lips, replaced by the more immediate reality of survival. She was alive, she was warm, and the woman named Sarah was looking at her with an expression that Eleanor, who had spent nearly 4 decades reading the faces of patients and families, couldn't quite interpret. "You're in shock," Sarah said. Her voice was calm now, matter of fact, as if hypothermic elderly women showed up on her doorstep every day. You need to get warm. You need to rest. Tomorrow I'll answer your questions. Tonight you need to survive. Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers. Niece wanted to understand how her dying husband had found the strength to build a cabin and rescue a stranger while his own wife believed he was slipping away into confusion and memory. But Sarah was right. Eleanor's body was shutting down in ways she could feel. The bone-deep exhaustion, the ache in her joints, the fog that kept drifting across her thoughts. She allowed Sarah to help her to a cot near the stove, allowed herself to be covered in quilts that smelled faintly of wood smoke and cedar, allowed her eyes to close against the golden light of the oil lamp. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was Sarah settling into the chair Eleanor had just vacated, wrapping herself in a blanket, her thin face illuminated by the glow of the fire, keeping watch, standing guard, as if Eleanor were something precious that needed protecting, as if Thomas had asked her to. Eleanor dreamed of her husband that night, but not the Thomas of his final months, confused, diminished, struggling to remember words he had used 1,000 times. She dreamed of the Thomas she had married, 29 years old, broad-shouldered and weathered from outdoor work, with hands that could build anything and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed. In the dream, they were standing on the back porch of the farmhouse, looking out at the land that stretched toward the mountains, and Thomas was trying to tell her something important. His lips moved, but no sound came out, and Eleanor kept asking, What are you trying to say? But the words were lost in the wind, and then she woke to the sound of a child crying. She sat up too fast, and her body punished her for it, every muscle screaming, then every joint locked with cold and strain, her head swimming in a way that told her she had come closer to dying than she wanted to admit. The cabin was filled with gray morning light, and the storm had quieted to something that sounded almost peaceful. The wood stove still radiated heat, and Sarah was no longer in the chair. She was standing by the far wall, where a curtain Eleanor hadn't noticed in the darkness now hung open, revealing a space behind it. And from that space came the sound that had woken her. Not a baby's cry, but a child's. A little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, with tangled dark hair and a face still soft with sleep, was sitting up on a cot and rubbing her eyes and asking for something in a voice too quiet for Eleanor to make out the words. Sarah murmured something back, lifted the child, and turned around, and saw Eleanor watching. For a moment, nobody moved. Eleanor took in the scene like she was looking at a photograph. The young woman, the child in her arms, the small space behind the curtain that clearly served as a separate sleeping area. The child's face, the shape of her eyes, something familiar in the curve of her cheek. And then Sarah spoke, her voice carefully neutral. This is my daughter, Grace. She's 4. She doesn't know anyone else is here yet. She might be scared at first. Eleanor nodded slowly, her mind still struggling to catch up with everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. She tried to smile at the child, but her face felt frozen, not from the cold this time, but from the strangeness of this situation, from the vertigo of waking in a place that shouldn't exist with people who shouldn't be here. The child, Grace, studied her with the unfiltered curiosity of early childhood, then turned and buried her face in Sarah's shoulder. Sarah stroked her hair and looked at Eleanor over the top of her head. She's shy with strangers. It took her a week to warm up to your husband when he first found us. Eleanor felt the words land like stones. When he first found us, the plural. Thomas hadn't just built a cabin and saved a young woman. He had saved a mother and daughter. He had created a refuge for people he had never mentioned, in a place his wife had never seen, during years when Eleanor had believed she knew everything about his life. The questions she had been too exhausted to ask last night rose up in her chest, and this time she couldn't hold them back. How, she said. Her voice was rough from cold and sleep and something else. Something that might have been grief or anger or simple bewilderment. How did my husband find you? How long have you been here? Why didn't he ever tell me? Sarah sat down on the edge of her cot, settling Grace in her lap. The child had produced a stuffed animal from somewhere, a rabbit, gray and worn, with one ear hanging by a thread, and was whispering to it in the private language of childhood. Sarah watched her for a moment, and when she looked up at Eleanor, Her eyes held something that might have been compassion. "It's a long story, and I don't think you're going to like all of it." Eleanor wrapped the quilt tighter around her shoulders. She thought about Richard's hand on her arm, guiding her to the car yesterday morning. Thought about Patricia's blank face as they drove past the turn that should have taken them to town. Thought about the way the SUV had slowed, the way the door had opened, the way she had found herself standing on the side of the road with the snow already beginning to swirl. "I've already heard the worst stories of my life in the last 24 hours. Nothing you tell me can be worse than what my son did." Sarah's expression flickered. Surprise, then something harder. "Your son left you out there, in the storm, on purpose. It wasn't a question." Eleanor answered anyway. "Yes. And you know why?" Eleanor had spent the hours of the drive replaying every conversation of the last 14 months, every document she had signed, every piece of mail she had been discouraged from opening. "I think I do now. The property, the land, Thomas's pension, the money his grandfather left. Richard and Patricia wanted it all, and I was in the way." Sarah nodded slowly. Yet she didn't look shocked. She looked like someone watching a prediction come true. "Your husband knew," she said quietly. "He knew what they were going to do. Not exactly, not the specifics, but he knew they were going to take everything. He spent the last 2 years of his life trying to protect you. This cabin, the things he left here, me. It was all part of his plan. The only problem is..." She paused, looking down at Grace, her voice dropping. "He ran out of time. He was supposed to tell you himself. He was supposed to bring you here and explain everything. But then he got sicker, faster than anyone expected, and by the end, he couldn't remember why any of it mattered. He just kept saying your name, kept saying he had to tell Ellie something, kept forgetting what it was." Eleanor felt the tears come before she could stop them, hot on her cold cheeks, blurring the gray light of the cabin, turning Sarah and Grace into shapes without definition. She cried for Thomas, who had tried to save her and failed. She cried for herself, crawling through snow toward a rescue her husband had built but couldn't deliver. She cried for the years she had wasted trusting her son, the money she had handed over, the documents she had signed without reading because Richard had told her everything was fine, because Richard had told her he was handling it, because Richard had kissed her cheek and called her mom and looked at her with eyes that held nothing but calculation. The tears came and came, and at some point Sarah crossed the room and sat beside her and put an arm around her shoulders. And the child, Grace, appeared in front of her holding the stuffed rabbit out like an offering. "You can hold Margaret," Grace said. "Margaret makes everything better." Eleanor took the rabbit with hands that trembled for more than cold. She held it against her chest and felt the simple weight of it, the softness worn smooth by years of love, and something in her chest cracked open in a way that was painful and necessary. She was alone in a cabin with a stranger and a child, and a storm still dying outside, and her son had tried to kill her, and her husband was dead, and nothing in her life looked the way it had looked 24 hours ago. But she was alive. She was warm. And someone had handed her a stuffed rabbit and told her it would make everything better. It wasn't enough, but it was something. She and Sarah gave her an hour to recover before she started talking. She brewed coffee from supplies that Eleanor didn't ask about, cooked oatmeal on the wood stove for Grace, and moved around the cabin with the ease of someone who had lived in small spaces all her life. Eleanor watched and began to notice details she had missed in the darkness and chaos of the previous night. The cabin was small but well built. Tight joints, solid walls, a floor that didn't creak. The furniture was all Thomas's work, which Eleanor recognized instantly after 47 years of living with his creations. A table with turned legs, a set of shelves built into the wall, the chair she had sat in last night. There was a bookshelf against one wall filled with paperbacks and a small stack of toys in one corner for Grace. And a row of hooks by the door holding coats and scarves and a child's small pink mittens. Someone had been living here. Someone had made this place a home. And Thomas, her Thomas, who had been dying while she watched helplessly, had made it possible. When the oatmeal was eaten and Grace was occupied with a book of pictures, Sarah sat across from Eleanor at the table and began to talk. "I met your husband 4 years ago," she said. "I was 22. Grace was 6 months old. I was living in my car in the parking lot behind the grocery store in Briarwood, and I had been there for 3 weeks." Her voice was flat, recounting facts without emotion. but Eleanor had spent decades listening to patients tell stories they didn't want to tell, and she heard the pain underneath the flatness. Things had gone bad. The baby's father left before she was born. My mother was dead. My stepfather didn't want anything to do with me once I was pregnant. I had a job at a diner for a while, but the owner didn't want a baby in the back, and I couldn't afford childcare, and eventually She stopped. Drew a breath. Eventually, I was living in my car. It was November. It was getting cold. Grace had a cough that wouldn't go away, and I couldn't afford a doctor, and I knew that if I didn't find somewhere warm soon, we were both going to die. Eleanor's hands tightened around her coffee cup. She thought about November 4 years ago. Thomas had still been healthy then, or healthy enough. He had been working in his shop every day, coming home smelling of sawdust and lacquer, talking about projects she half listened to while she cooked dinner. She had been so certain she knew every detail of his life. She had been so certain there were no secrets. Your husband came to the grocery store one morning, Sarah continued. I was parked in my usual spot, and Grace was crying because she was hungry, and I didn't have any formula left, and I was trying to figure out if I had enough change in my pocket to buy 1 can of the cheap stuff. He walked by my car, and he stopped. He just stopped and looked at me, and I thought he was going to call the cops, or tell me to leave, or say something awful the way most people did. But he didn't. He knocked on my window and he said, Sarah's voice wavered for the first time. He said, "That baby sounds hungry. Let me buy her some formula." And I said no, because that's what you say when you're living in your car and a stranger offers to help, because nothing is free and everyone wants something. But he didn't leave. He just stood there in the cold and he said, "I have a daughter about your age. If she was in trouble, I'd want someone to help her." And something about the way he said it. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I let him help. I let him buy formula and diapers and some food for me, and then he asked where I was staying, and I told him the truth because I was too tired to lie anymore. And he said he had a place, a cabin up on the mountain. No one used it anymore. It wasn't much, but it was warm and it was safe, and I could stay there as long as I needed. Eleanor's coffee had gone cold in her hands. She set it down carefully, as if the cup might shatter. Thomas had told her he had a daughter about your age, but he didn't have a daughter. He had a son, Richard, and 2 older children who had died, twin girls, stillborn at 32 weeks, 6 years before Richard was born. Eleanor had been 26 when she lost them. She had never fully recovered, and Thomas had never mentioned them to strangers, never invoked them casually, never used them as a reason to do anything. But here was Sarah, saying that he had. Here was Sarah, saying that Thomas had looked at her and seen the daughters he had lost. The cabin was already built when he brought me here, Sarah said. He told me he'd started it years ago as a hunting camp, but then he decided he didn't want to hunt anymore, so it just sat here empty. He came by every week or so to bring supplies, firewood, food, diapers for Grace. He helped me apply for assistance, helped me get my GED, helped me find remote work I could do from here on a laptop he bought me. He never asked for anything in return. She stopped, her face twisting with the effort of controlling her emotions. He was the first person in my entire life who helped me without wanting something back. And when he started getting sick, when he couldn't come by as often, he sat me down and told me everything. About you, about your son, about what he was afraid was going to happen. Eleanor's heart was pounding now, a slow, heavy rhythm that felt like a countdown. What did he tell you? He told me your son had changed, that your son's wife was, he used the word poisonous. He said they were isolating you, controlling you, preparing to take everything you had. He said he had tried to warn you, but you didn't believe him because Richard was your son, and you loved him, and you couldn't see what he'd become. He said, Sarah met Eleanor's eyes with something fierce in her gaze. He said his biggest fear was dying before he could protect you. He said he was building this place as a backup plan, somewhere you could come if everything fell apart, somewhere they couldn't touch you. He made me promise that if you ever found your way here, I would help you, that I would tell you the truth, that I would show you what he left. What he left? Eleanor's voice came out as a whisper. Sarah stood and crossed to the far wall. She reached behind the bookshelf and did something Eleanor couldn't see, and a section of the wall swung open, a hidden panel, invisible if you didn't know it was there. Behind it was a space just big enough for a metal lockbox, which Sarah lifted out and set on the table in front of Eleanor. The box was old, scarred with age and use. And the lock was a combination dial that Eleanor recognized as one Thomas had used on his shop's safe for decades. "The combination is your anniversary," Sarah said. "He told me you'd know." Eleanor's hands were shaking as she reached for the dial. June 14th, 1975. The day she had married Thomas in a small ceremony behind her parents' house, with wildflowers in her hair and her whole life ahead of her. She turned the dial. 6:14:75. The lock clicked open. Inside the box were papers, dozens of them, bank statements and legal documents and photographs and handwritten letters in Thomas's cramped script. Eleanor lifted the first layer with hands that had stopped trembling, replaced now by a stillness that felt like the calm before a storm. She began to read. See, the first document was a copy of their original deed to the property, the 40 acres that had been in Thomas's family for over a century. Beneath it was a second deed, dated 3 years ago, transferring ownership of 10 of those acres, the section that included the cabin, to a trust in Eleanor's name, a trust she had never heard of, a trust managed by a law firm in a city 200 miles away. Eleanor stared at the document and felt her understanding of the past 3 years begin to shift and crack. Thomas had done this. Thomas had carved out a piece of their land and hidden it away, protected by lawyers Richard didn't know about, owned by a trust that couldn't be touched by power of attorney or family manipulation. Thomas had saved her. The letters came next. There were 23 of them, written over the course of Thomas's final 2 years, each one dated and carefully sealed. Eleanor opened them in order and read her husband's voice, reaching out to her from beyond death. The first letters were clear and lucid, explaining what he had seen and what he feared. "Richard has changed," he wrote in April 3 years ago. "He looks at you like you're a problem to be solved. Patricia whispers things when she thinks I can't hear. They're planning something, Ellie. I know you don't want to believe it, but I've seen the way they count our silverware, the way they ask about the deed, the way they've started talking about how big the house is for just 2 old people. I'm trying to protect you. I'm building something, a place and a plan. But my memory is slipping, and I'm scared I won't get to tell you in time. If you're reading this, I failed. I'm sorry. I should have made you listen. I should have found a way to make you see." The later letters were harder to read. The handwriting deteriorated, the thoughts fragmented. By the final letter, dated 2 weeks before Thomas died, the words were almost illegible, scattered across the page in no particular order. Ellie, the cabin, Sarah, trust, don't let them take, important, so important, love you, always, Ellie. And beneath the words, repeated over and over in the margins like a prayer or a spell, the bird. Remember the bird. The bird. Eleanor set down the final letter and sat in silence for a long moment. Grace had fallen asleep on the cot behind the curtain, and Sarah was watching her with an expression that held both hope and fear. Hope that Eleanor would understand, fear that she wouldn't. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackle of the fire and the distant whisper of wind around the eaves, and Eleanor felt the weight of everything she had learned pressing against her chest like a physical burden. Her husband had spent his final years trying to save her. Her son had spent those same years planning to destroy her. And she had been blind to both of them, blind to Thomas's growing fear and blind to Richard's growing cruelty, so focused on the daily work of caring for a dying man that she had missed the war being waged around her. "The bird," she said finally. "He keeps mentioning a bird. What does that mean?" Sarah's expression shifted. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, something Eleanor couldn't quite see in the dim light. She set it on the table, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Then it was a wooden bird, a cardinal, carved with the exquisite detail that had always been Thomas's signature. The feathers were individually rendered. The eyes were tiny chips of something dark that caught the light. And beneath the bird, carved into the base in letters so small Eleanor had to lean close to read them, were 4 words. "Turn me over, Ellie." Eleanor picked up the bird with hands that had started shaking again. It was heavier than she expected, too heavy for its size, as if something was hidden inside it. She turned it over and found a tiny latch, invisible unless you knew to look for it. She pressed the latch, and the bottom of the bird swung open, revealing a hollow interior, Inside was a USB drive and a folded piece of paper. The paper was a single page, covered in Thomas's earlier, clearer handwriting. It was dated 6 months before his death, and it was addressed to her. "Ellie," it read, "if you're holding this, then things went wrong the way I was afraid they would. The USB drive contains everything I was able to collect. Records of money Richard and Patricia have been moving out of your accounts, evidence of forged signatures on documents you never signed, emails they didn't know I could access. I hired a private investigator 2 years ago. I'm sorry I never told you. I knew you wouldn't believe me if I just said the words. You love Richard. You've always loved him. But Richard stopped being the boy you raised a long time ago. Maybe he was never that boy. Maybe I just wanted to believe he was because he was ours, and losing him felt like losing the girls all over again. What matters is this. You have what you need to fight back. Or the land with the cabin is legally yours, and no one can take it. The evidence on this drive will put Richard and Patricia in prison if you choose to use it. And Sarah, I know you're wondering about Sarah. She's not the girl I told her I was saving her for. She's the girl I was saving because I couldn't save our daughters. She's good, Ellie. She's kind. And she needs someone too. Maybe you can help each other. I love you. I've loved you since you stitched up my hand and told me no. I've loved you every single day of our life together. And I'm sorry I couldn't tell you all this in person. I'm sorry I couldn't make you listen. But I'm not sorry I fought for you. I'd fight for you again. 1,000 times. 1,000,000 times. Until the end of everything. Thomas. Eleanor set the letter down and pressed her hands against her face. The tears came again, different this time. Not the tears of shock and grief she had wept earlier, but something rawer, something that came from a deeper place. Thomas had known. Thomas had fought. Thomas had spent his dying years building a fortress around her while she changed his sheets and gave him his medicine and watched him fade, thinking she was alone in her worry, thinking she was the only one who saw the shadows gathering. But he had seen them too. He had seen them first. And when his mind began to fail, when the words slipped away and the memories scattered, the one thing he had held on to, the one thing that had survived the wreckage of his fading brain, was her. Her name, her safety, her survival. He had loved her until the very end. He had loved her beyond the end. And she had nearly died on the side of a road without ever knowing. The storm ended on the 3rd day, leaving behind a landscape so white and still it looked like another world entirely. Eleanor had spent those 3 days sleeping, healing, and listening to Sarah tell the story of the past 4 years. How Thomas had visited every week at first, then every 2 weeks as his health declined, then monthly, then finally not at all. How he had brought books for Sarah and toys for Grace, and once, in the final months, a photograph of Eleanor that he propped on the bookshelf where Sarah could see it. "That's her," he had said, his voice already starting to slip. "That's my Ellie. You'll know her when you see her. She has kind eyes." Sarah had kept the photograph. She showed it to Eleanor now, a picture from maybe 10 years ago. Taken at some family gathering, Eleanor couldn't quite remember. In the photo, she was laughing at something off camera, her hair still more brown than gray, her face still free of the deep lines that the past 3 years had carved. Kind eyes. Thomas had thought she had kind eyes, even when she was blind to everything happening around her, even when she was signing documents that gave her son control of her life, even when she was failing to hear the warnings her husband was trying to give her. Thomas had looked at her and seen kindness. On the 4th day, Eleanor walked out of the cabin and stood in the snow and looked down at the valley where her farmhouse lay hidden beyond the trees. She could see a curl of smoke rising from somewhere in that direction, the house probably, where Richard and Patricia were likely congratulating themselves on a problem solved. They would have reported her missing by now. Perhaps they had even shed a few public tears, played the role of grieving children, searching desperately for their poor, confused mother who had wandered away in the storm. The thought of them performing grief while believing she was dead filled Eleanor with a cold fury that felt almost cleansing after days of sorrow and confusion. They thought they had won. They thought the storm had done their work for them, buried their inconvenient mother under snow that wouldn't melt for months. They had no idea that she was standing on a mountain looking down at them, holding a USB drive that would destroy their lives. Sarah came out to stand beside her, wrapped in one of Thomas's old coats. Grace was inside, occupied with a book of puzzles that Eleanor had found in the lockbox, along with everything else. One more gift from a dying man who had thought of everything. The two women stood in silence for a long moment, watching their breath fog in the cold air, watching the sun turn the snow to diamonds. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked finally. Eleanor thought about the question. She had been thinking about it for 3 days, turning the options over in her mind the way she used to turn diagnostic puzzles over during her years as a nurse. She could go to the police, she could hire a lawyer, she could release the evidence on the USB drive and watch Richard and Patricia face justice for their crimes. All of those options were available to her. All of those options would work, but none of them felt complete. None of them addressed the thing that gnawed at her when she woke in the night and listened to Grace's soft breathing across the cabin. "Richard is my son," she said. The words came slowly, pulled from somewhere deep. "I held him when he was an hour old. I nursed him through scarlet fever and chickenpox and a broken arm he got falling out of the oak tree in the backyard. I went to every baseball game, every school play, every parent-teacher conference. I loved him so completely that I didn't see what he was becoming. I didn't see that the boy I raised had turned into someone capable of leaving his mother to die in a snowstorm. And I keep asking myself, when did it happen? When did he become this? Was there a moment I could have stopped it? A conversation I should have had? A warning I should have heeded? Or was it always there, while hiding behind the face I wanted to see, waiting for the moment when there was something worth taking?" Sarah didn't answer. She understood that Eleanor wasn't asking for a response. She was asking the question that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Thomas tried to tell me," Eleanor continued. "He tried to tell me, and I didn't want to hear it, because hearing it would have meant admitting that my son, my only surviving child, the boy I nearly died having, the boy I built my entire identity as a mother around, was a stranger, was someone I didn't know. And I couldn't face that. I couldn't face the idea that 40 years of loving him had meant nothing, that he had never loved me back, that everything I thought we had was a lie he told me while he waited for me to become useful." The wind picked up, sending a spray of snow off the pine branches above them. Eleanor watched it fall and felt something settle inside her. Not peace, exactly, not yet, but a decision. "I'm going to go back," she said. "I'm going to walk into that house and look my son in the face and let him see that I survived. I'm going to let him understand what he did. And then I'm going to give him a choice." "A choice?" Eleanor turned to look at Sarah, and her face was calm in a way that Sarah hadn't seen before. "He can confess. He can return everything he's taken, sign the property back to me, and turn himself into the police. Or he can refuse, and I'll release everything Thomas collected, and he'll go to prison anyway. But he'll go, knowing that his mother destroyed him, that the woman he tried to kill was the one who brought him down." Sarah studied her for a long moment. "You'd give him a chance to confess? After everything he did?" Eleanor thought about it, thought about Richard's face when he shoved her out of the car, thought about the look in his eyes. Not hatred, not anger, just cold calculation. She hadn't been a person to him in that moment. She had been an obstacle, a problem to be removed. And somewhere underneath her fury and her grief, underneath the betrayal that had cracked her sense of the world in two, she remembered a boy with skinned knees running to her for comfort. She remembered a teenager who had cried when his grandfather died. She remembered the man who had held her hand at Thomas's funeral and told her everything would be okay. That man had been a lie, but Eleanor had loved him, had believed in him, had shaped herself around him. And she couldn't become someone who destroyed without offering a path back, even a path that would never be taken, even a path that existed only to prove she had tried. "Thomas believed in redemption," she said quietly. "He believed people could change if they chose to. I'm not sure I believe that anymore, but I'm going to give Richard the chance, for Thomas, and for the boy I used to think he was." Sarah nodded slowly. She didn't argue. She had known Thomas too, had seen the way he treated everyone. The homeless woman in a parking lot, the daughter of a man who would one day try to kill his wife, as if they were capable of grace. She understood why Eleanor needed to do this, and she understood that it would probably end the way they both expected, with Richard refusing, with the evidence released, Shara with everything Thomas had built used exactly as he had intended it. "I'll come with you," Sarah said. "Grace can stay here, I'll lock the doors, and she knows not to go outside alone, but you shouldn't face them by yourself." Eleanor looked at the young woman she had known for only 4 days, looked at the face that had once been hungry and desperate and alone, that had been saved by a dying man's kindness, that had become the guardian of Eleanor's salvation without ever knowing her. And she understood something that Thomas must have understood years ago, that family wasn't about blood, it was about choice. It was about who stood beside you when everything else fell apart. It was about who showed up. "Okay," Eleanor said. "Let's go." The walk down the mountain took 2 hours. The snow was deep, but packed enough to walk on. And Sarah knew the trails that wound through the forest toward the valley below. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. Eleanor's body ached from the days of recovery, and every step reminded her of how close she had come to dying. But she kept walking. She walked through the pain in her hip, and the stiffness in her joints, and the cold that tried to seep back into her bones. She walked because Thomas had asked her to, because her son had tried to take everything and failed, because she was 72 years old and she had survived, and she was going to make damn sure that Richard knew it. The farmhouse appeared through the trees like something from a dream. The same house Eleanor had lived in for 47 years, the same porch Thomas had built, the same windows she had looked out of every morning. But it looked different now, smaller, older. The paint was peeling in places she hadn't noticed before. The garden Thomas had tended was overgrown and dead, and there was a car in the driveway she didn't recognize, sleek and expensive, the kind of car Richard and Patricia had been saying they couldn't afford while they drained Eleanor's accounts. Eleanor stopped at the edge of the trees and looked at her home and felt something cold and clear crystallize in her chest. "They're both in there," Sarah said quietly. She had been watching the windows. "I can see them moving in the kitchen." Eleanor took a breath, thought of Thomas, thought of the letters in her pocket, the USB drive in a case against her chest, the weight of everything she had learned. Then she stepped out of the trees and started walking toward the house. Richard saw her through the kitchen window when she was halfway across the yard. She watched his face go through a series of expressions that would have been comical in any other situation: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally a pale fear that looked almost like shame. He disappeared from the window. A moment later, the front door flew open, and he was standing on the porch, Patricia behind him, both of them staring at Eleanor like she was a ghost risen from the snow. "Mom," Richard said. His voice cracked on the word. How did you... We looked everywhere. We called the police. We thought..." Eleanor stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Sarah had hung back at the edge of the yard, visible but not intrusive, watching. The morning sun was bright on the snow, and Eleanor squinted against it as she looked up at her son. "Mom, you thought I was dead," she said. Her voice was steady, calm, almost gentle. "That was the plan, wasn't it? Leave me on the side of the road in a blizzard and let nature do what you couldn't do yourself. No evidence, no witnesses. Just a confused old woman who wandered off and froze." Richard's face went through another transformation, this time from fear to calculation. He was trying to figure out how to spin this, Eleanor realized. What story to tell, what lies might still work. But Patricia's face showed only naked panic, and Eleanor understood that the daughter-in-law had always been the weaker link. Thomas had known that too. The emails on the USB drive proved it. "Mom," Richard said, and his voice had shifted now into something wounded and confused. "I don't know what you're talking about. We were taking you to town. You got confused. Once you opened the door, you fell out. We stopped the car and you were gone. We've been searching for you for days. We've been worried sick." Eleanor almost laughed. The performance was perfect. The concerned son, the hurt confusion, the implication that she was senile and mistaken. If she hadn't spent 3 days reading Thomas's letters, if she didn't have a USB drive full of evidence pressed against her chest, she might almost have believed it. She might have let him take her arm and guide her inside and tell her how worried he'd been, how relieved he was that she was safe, how they needed to talk about maybe finding somewhere more appropriate for her to live. She might have let him do it all over again. But she wasn't that woman anymore. That woman had died in the snow. The woman standing on the porch was someone new. "I'm only going to say this once," Eleanor said, "and I want you to listen very carefully." She reached into her coat and pulled out the USB drive, holding it up so they could see. Your father knew what you were doing. He knew about the money you've been stealing, the documents you've been forging, the property you've been trying to take. He spent 2 years collecting evidence. Everything is on this drive. Bank records, emails, recordings, enough to put both of you in prison for a very long time. Richard's mask slipped completely. She watched the charm drain out of his face, leaving behind something ugly and desperate. Mom, whatever you think you have, it's not what it looks like. Dad was confused at the end, you know he was. He didn't know what he was doing. He knew exactly what he was doing, Eleanor said, and so do I. Well, here's what's going to happen, Richard. You have 2 choices. You can confess, sign the property back to me, return the money you've stolen, and turn yourself in to the police. If you do that, I will tell them you cooperated. I will tell them you were manipulated by your wife and you regret what you did. You might get a reduced sentence. You might have a chance at something like a life when you get out. Or you refuse. And I take this drive to the police myself, along with Thomas's letters, along with the private investigator's reports, along with testimony from a witness your father prepared before he died. And you go to prison anyway, but you go knowing that your mother is the one who put you there, that the woman you left in the snow to die was the one who destroyed everything you tried to build. Patricia made a sound, a small choked noise of fear. Richard's face had gone gray. He looked at the USB drive, then at Eleanor, then at Sarah standing at the edge of the yard. And for just a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been the boy Eleanor remembered, the boy who had cried at his grandfather's funeral, the boy who had once been capable of love. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold calculation that had always been there underneath. And Eleanor understood that her son had never really existed. He had only ever been a mask worn by someone she didn't know. You can't prove anything, Richard said. His voice had gone flat. That drive could have anything on it. Dad was senile. His evidence is worthless. And who's your witness? Some homeless woman he found in a parking lot? He laughed. Why, but there was no humor in it. Go ahead, Mom. Go to the police. See what happens when a confused old woman tries to accuse her loving son of attempted murder based on the ramblings of her dead husband. See who they believe. Eleanor felt the words land and felt nothing. She had expected this. Thomas had expected this. The USB drive contained more than just evidence of financial crimes. It contained recordings, conversations Richard hadn't known were being recorded, videos from cameras Thomas had installed in the farmhouse during his final months. There was enough on that drive to end any defense Richard could mount, but Eleanor didn't tell him that. She simply nodded. If that's your choice, she said. She put the USB drive back in her pocket. She turned toward the edge of the yard, where Sarah was waiting. Yeah, and then she stopped and looked back at her son one more time. Your father loved you, she said. Until the end, even when he knew what you were, he hoped you would change. He hoped the evidence would never need to be used. He hoped you would choose to be better. But he was wrong about you, Richard. He was wrong about you the same way I was wrong about you, and I'm done being wrong. She walked away. She didn't look back again. Sarah fell into step beside her, and together they walked across the yard, through the trees, and back toward the mountain. Behind them, Richard was screaming something. Accusations, threats, pleas that might have been genuine, or might have been another performance. It didn't matter. Eleanor had said what she needed to say. She had offered the choice Thomas would have offered. And now she was going to do what Thomas had really wanted her to do all along. She was going to survive. She was going to live. And she was going to build something new from the wreckage of everything she had lost. The trial lasted 6 months. Richard and Patricia were charged with attempted murder, elder abuse, fraud, embezzlement, and a dozen other crimes that the prosecutors discovered once they started looking. The USB drive was everything Thomas had promised. Recordings, documents, a paper trail so clear and damning that even Richard's expensive lawyers couldn't spin it away. Patricia broke first, offering testimony against her husband in exchange for a reduced sentence. Richard fought to the end, maintaining his innocence even as witness after witness took the stand, even as his own emails were read aloud in court, but even as a video played showing him discussing with Patricia how much longer they would have to wait before Eleanor was too confused to resist. He was convicted on all counts. He received 15 years. Patricia received 7. Eleanor sat in the courtroom through every day of the trial, and she did not cry. She cried later in the cabin that had become her home. She cried in the night when Grace was asleep and Sarah was reading by lamplight and the mountain was quiet around them. She cried for the son she had lost, not to prison, but to something that had happened long before, something she would never fully understand. She cried for Thomas, who had fought so hard to protect her and died believing he had failed. She cried for herself, for the years she had wasted, for the trust she had given so freely to people who had seen her only as a means to an end. And then, when the tears were finished, she got up and made breakfast for Grace and helped Sarah repair the shed roof and walked the property lines of the land that was hers again. She kept living. It was the only thing she knew how to do. The cabin grew over the years that followed. Eleanor hired builders to add a second room, then a third. She had the old farmhouse torn down. She couldn't live there anymore, couldn't look at the kitchen where Richard and Patricia had plotted, couldn't walk the halls where Thomas had installed hidden cameras to protect her. The land was still hers, but she let it go wild, let the forests reclaim what the Whitmores had cleared a century ago. Only the cabin remained, the place Thomas had built for a stranger who had become a daughter, the place where Eleanor had crawled in from the snow to find impossible salvation. She lived there with Sarah and Grace until Grace was old enough for school, and then she helped Sarah buy a house in town, and then she lived alone with her books and her memories and the carved wooden bird that sat on her windowsill where she could see it every day. Sarah visited every week. Grace grew tall and bright and fearless, and she called Eleanor Grandma Ellie, even though there was no blood between them. The stuffed rabbit Margaret presided over Grace's bedroom until she was 13, and then it moved to a shelf where it could watch over her as she grew. Eleanor attended every school play and every soccer game. And she told Grace stories about Thomas, about the man who had carved a bird to hold a secret, who had built a cabin to save a stranger, who had loved his wife so completely that his final act was to protect her from the son he couldn't save. Grace listened to these stories with the serious attention of a child who understood that they were important. And when she was old enough, Eleanor showed her the letters Thomas had written, and the photographs, and the carved bird with its hidden compartment. "I don't understand," Grace said, holding the bird carefully in her hands. She was 16 now, long-limbed and graceful, with Sarah's dark hair and a stubbornness that reminded Eleanor painfully of Thomas. How did he know? How did he know you would find the cabin? How did he know any of this would work? Eleanor smiled. It was a sad smile, but there was warmth in it too. He didn't know. He hoped. He built this place, and he filled it with everything he thought I might need, and he hoped that if the worst happened, I would find my way here. But he couldn't know for certain. None of us can know for certain. We just have to do what we can and hope it's enough. Grace turned the bird over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the smooth wood worn even smoother by years of Eleanor's touch. And it was, she said. Enough, I mean. It worked. Eleanor reached out and touched the girl's cheek. This child who was no blood of hers, this granddaughter she had never expected to have. Yes, she said, it worked. Not the way he planned, not without cost, but it worked. The sun was setting over the mountain, painting the snow orange and pink and gold. From this, Eleanor stood at the window of the cabin, larger now, warmer now, filled with photographs and books and the accumulated evidence of a life rebuilt, and watched the light change. She was 79 years old. Her body ached in ways she had learned to accept. Her son was still in prison, and she had not visited him, and she did not plan to. But she was alive. She was loved, and she had learned something in the years since she crawled out of a snowstorm into a cabin that shouldn't have existed. She had learned that survival isn't about being strong enough to endure alone. It's about being lucky enough to find the people who will carry you when you can't carry yourself. It's about a dying man who built a cabin for a stranger because he saw his lost daughters in her eyes. Much it's about a young woman who kept watch through a blizzard because a man she barely knew had asked her to. It's about a little girl who handed her stuffed rabbit to a frozen stranger and said this will make everything better. It's about love, not the easy kind, not the kind that never fails or disappoints or leaves you bleeding on the side of a road, but the real kind, the kind that shows up, the kind that builds, the kind that survives. If you're watching this right now, if you're in the middle of your own storm, if the people who should have protected you have left you alone in the cold, I want you to take something from Eleanor's story. Not that everything will be okay. It might not be. Not that you'll find a hidden cabin built by someone who loved you. You probably won't. But this, that survival is possible. That there are still people who will help without asking for anything in return. That you can lose everything you thought you needed and discover that what you actually needed was something else entirely. Something smaller, something simpler. Someone handing you a cup of broth in the darkness and saying you're safe now. You're safe now. It's not the end of the story. It's never the end of the story. But it's enough of a beginning to keep going. And keeping going is all any of us can do. Eleanor understood that now. Thomas had understood it when he built the cabin, when he wrote the letters, when he carved a bird to hold his final secret. And somewhere out there, someone who needs to hear this story is listening. That's enough. That's enough.